Chapter 1. Ed Ames' legendary tomahawk throw. In April 1965, Johnny Carson welcomed actor Ed Ames, best known at the time for playing Mingo on the frontier drama Daniel Boone. Ames had been invited to demonstrate the skill of tomahawk throwing, something his television character frequently displayed with ease. What began as a straightforward demonstration would turn into one of the most unforgettable moments in live television history. A wooden target shaped like a cowboy was rolled onto the Tonight Show stage. Ames patiently explained the mechanics of his throw, while Carson, with his usual mix of curiosity and polite attentiveness, stood off to the side. The expectation was simple: a clean throw into the board, a little banter, and then on to the next segment. But television, especially live television, has a way of creating its own stories. When Ames released the tomahawk, it spun gracefully through the air with perfect accuracy, except for where it landed. Instead of striking the chest or shoulder of the wooden figure, the blade buried itself squarely in the target's crotch. For a brief moment, there was silence, as if the audience wasn't sure if they had just seen what they thought they had. Then, the entire studio erupted with explosive laughter. The reaction was contagious, but what elevated the moment into legend was not the accident itself. It was Johnny Carson's response. Normally the embodiment of late-night composure, Johnny doubled over with laughter, completely unable to continue the show. He clutched his desk, gasped for air, and wiped tears streaming down his face. For almost 3 minutes, a lifetime in television, Carson was lost in genuine, uncontrollable hilarity. Finally, when he regained just enough breath to speak, Johnny delivered a line that sealed the moment's place in comedy history. "I didn't even know you were Jewish." The audience roared even louder, and Ames could only grin sheepishly at his unintended target. That single quip transformed an already hilarious accident into a piece of comedic perfection. Producers and crew members later recalled that they had never seen Johnny laugh so hard, so freely, or so long on camera. It was one of those rare times when the polished facade of The Tonight Show's host completely dropped away, allowing viewers to see Carson as just another human caught in an absurd situation. That authenticity was what endeared him to millions. The tomahawk mishap was replayed endlessly over the decades, from clip shows to Carson's farewell week in 1992. It became shorthand for the unpredictable magic of live television and a reminder of why Carson's reign lasted 3 decades. As one NBC executive later said, "That night, America didn't see a host. They saw Johnny." Number 2. Don Rickles and the broken cigarette box. Johnny Carson's desk on The Tonight Show was more than just a piece of furniture. It was part of his stage persona. Every object was chosen carefully, and one of his most prized possessions was a small wooden cigarette box that sat prominently in front of him night after night. For Johnny, the box was a personal keepsake, a detail that represented his meticulous sense of order. So when comedian Don Rickles guest hosted the show in October 1973, he couldn't have predicted that a small accident would spark one of the most legendary, unscripted moments in Carson's career. During the broadcast, Rickles, already known for his chaotic, unpredictable style, managed to break Carson's cherished cigarette box while fumbling around the desk. Rickles laughed it off in the moment, but everyone in the studio knew Johnny would not take the damage lightly. When Carson returned to his desk the following evening, he immediately pointed out the broken box to his audience, holding it up with mock seriousness. With a gleam in his eye, he promised that Rickles would have to answer for what he'd done. The viewers laughed, but most assumed it was just another throwaway gag that wouldn't go anywhere. What happened next proved just how far Johnny was willing to take a joke when the timing was right. A few months later, Rickles was filming his sitcom CPO Sharky on a nearby NBC soundstage. During a commercial break on The Tonight Show, Carson suddenly turned to his crew and asked, "Isn't Rickles taping today?" Without hesitation, he grabbed a camera crew and marched across the lot. What followed was one of the most unexpected and hilarious live crossovers in television history. Carson barged straight onto the set of CPO Sharky in the middle of filming, catching Rickles and the studio audience completely off guard. The sight of Johnny Carson storming onto another show's set with his broken cigarette box in hand was pure comedic theater. Rickles, dressed in his Navy uniform for the sitcom, looked stunned as Carson confronted him. The exchange that followed was priceless, Carson demanding justice for his ruined box, while Rickles tried desperately to charm and deflect his way out of trouble. The brilliance of the moment wasn't just the humor, it was the warmth beneath it. Viewers could sense the genuine friendship between Carson and Rickles. Johnny pretended to be furious. Rickles pretended to be remorseful. And together they created television magic that could never have been scripted. As one director later said, "Johnny wouldn't have done that for anyone else. It was his way of showing how much he actually loved Dawn." The incident became an instant classic, replayed for decades as one of the best examples of Carson abandoning his usual format for the sake of a spontaneous laugh. For Johnny, it was proof that sometimes the funniest moments weren't on his stage at all. They were waiting just next door. 3. Bette Midler makes Carson cry. By the spring of 1992, America knew Johnny Carson's legendary run on The Tonight Show was coming to an end. After 3 decades of shaping late-night television, Carson had announced his retirement, and the final weeks of his program were filled with nostalgia, tributes, and emotional appearances from some of his closest friends in show business. Among them was singer and actress Bette Midler, who would give Carson and his audience one of the most heartfelt send-offs in television history. On May 21, 1992, the penultimate episode aired, with Robin Williams and Bette Midler as Carson's final guests before his farewell show. Robin delivered his trademark manic comedy, leaving the audience doubled over. But it was Midler who shifted the tone of the evening. After her lively banter with Johnny, she suddenly told him, "I'd like to sing something for you." The studio grew quiet, sensing something rare was about to happen. Midler began to sing "One for My Baby" and "One More for the Road," a timeless ballad written by Harold Arlen and Johnny Mercer. The lyrics, built around themes of last calls and goodbyes, felt tailor-made for the moment. As she sang directly to Carson, the camera captured something extraordinary. The famously composed host, with tears brimming in his eyes. Carson had built his reputation on control, his wit, his timing, his ability to diffuse any situation with a perfectly placed punchline. But here, he didn't try to hide behind humor. He simply let the music wash over him. As one crew member later recalled, the entire room froze. You could hear a pin drop. Nobody wanted to break the spell. When Midler finished the song, she took Carson's hand gently. The gesture broke him completely. His eyes welled, his smile softened, and he leaned forward to kiss her hand in gratitude. For a man who had spent 30 years keeping his personal feelings carefully guarded, it was an uncharacteristically raw moment. Viewers at home witnessed Johnny Carson not just as the king of late night, but as a man saying goodbye to a massive chapter of his life. Critics and colleagues later described the segment as the most authentic moment of Carson's career. Unlike so many scripted goodbyes in television, nothing about Midler's tribute felt rehearsed. It was spontaneous, intimate, and deeply human. Carson's simple words after the performance, "I can't top that," served as both a final acknowledgement and a farewell. For many, this moment remains the emotional climax of Carson's long career. It proved that even the most unflappable entertainer could be moved to tears, and in doing so, Johnny gave his audience a gift. One last glimpse of the man behind the legend. Skirdihan, the monkey on Carson's head. Animal segments were a Tonight Show tradition. Viewers loved the unpredictability that came whenever handlers brought exotic creatures into Johnny Carson's studio. Sometimes the animals behaved, but often they didn't, and those were the moments audiences remembered. In 1979, handler Joanne Steele introduced Johnny and his viewers to a small capuchin monkey. What happened next became one of the funniest and most requested animal moments of Carson's career. At first, the segment looked routine. Steele explained the monkey's habits, gesturing with calm authority while the animal sat quietly. Johnny, with his usual mix of politeness and sly humor, leaned forward to listen. But television magic doesn't come from routine. It comes from chaos. Without warning, the monkey bounded from Steele's arm straight onto Carson's perfectly styled head. For a host whose appearance was always immaculate, the sight was surreal. Carson froze in his chair, his trademark hair suddenly serving as a jungle gym. The audience gasped, then erupted into laughter. Carson didn't swat the animal away or panic. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his expression a blend of resignation and deadpan humor, letting the absurdity of the scene speak for itself. Crew members later admitted they were struggling to keep their cameras steady because they were laughing so hard. Johnny's hair was sacred, one makeup artist said years later. To see it destroyed in seconds by a monkey, that was pure gold. When the capuchin finally clambered back to its handler, Johnny turned toward the camera, his hair completely disheveled, and delivered the perfect punchline. "And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why I prefer cats." The timing was impeccable. The audience roared even louder, not just at the line, but at the sight of Carson's hair standing on end. It was one of those moments when Johnny's genius for comedy shone through, not in a scripted monologue, but in his ability to embrace chaos and make himself part of the joke. What made the moment so enduring was Carson's willingness to surrender his dignity for the sake of a laugh. He never looked flustered, never broke into frustration. Instead, he leaned into the ridiculousness, showing viewers that even the king of late night could be humbled by a mischievous monkey. That humility made him relatable, human, and even more beloved. Chatikrom. The monkey incident was replayed countless times in highlight reels and anniversary specials. Fans wrote letters requesting the clip, and NBC kept it in heavy rotation whenever they wanted to showcase the unpredictable magic of The Tonight Show. Decades later, it still serves as a reminder. In live television, the funniest moments aren't scripted, they're surrendered to. 35. Steve Martin's absurdist magic routine. By 1980, Steve Martin was already reshaping American comedy. With his wild white suit, banjo playing, and surreal sense of humor, he was leading audiences into a new era of anti-comedy, where the joke was that nothing made sense. When Martin appeared on The Tonight Show that year, he brought with him a routine that would both puzzle and delight Johnny Carson. The now legendary Great Fly Dini. Carson introduced Martin as a magician, giving him the stage with his usual respect for performers. What followed was unlike any magic act anyone had seen before. Instead of producing rabbits from hats or cards from sleeves, Martin unzipped his fly and began pulling objects out of his pants. First came a cascade of eggs, then a salt shaker. Then, unbelievably, a ringing telephone. Each reveal was more bizarre than the last. Finally, he reached in and produced a tiny hand that waved to the audience, as though his own body had become a carnival sideshow. At first, Carson maintained his classic straight man composure. He sat behind his desk with the faint smile he often wore when sizing up a guest's routine. But as the absurdity piled higher, eggs, telephones, tiny appendages, Johnny began to lose it. His shoulders shook. His laughter slipped out in bursts. By the time Martin pulled the final trick, Carson was openly doubled over, tears of laughter streaming down his face. Writers and producers who were there recalled that Johnny wasn't playing along the way he sometimes did. He was genuinely caught off guard. Johnny loved being surprised. One writer later explained. He'd seen thousands of comedians, but Steve made him feel like a regular audience member again, completely unaware of what was coming next. That was the secret power of the great Flydini. It wasn't just about shock value. It was about subverting every expectation of both Carson and his viewers. Where most comics came armed with polished routines, Martin turned nonsense into art. Carson recognized it instantly, letting his own guard drop so that he too could enjoy the ridiculous spectacle. When the cameras stopped rolling, Johnny reportedly leaned over to a producer and said, "That's the kind of thing that makes this job worth doing." High praise from a man who had spent decades at the very center of American comedy. For Carson, Martin's appearance was a reminder of why he loved hosting The Tonight Show. The thrill of never knowing when something truly original might walk onto his stage. The clip has since become one of the defining Tonight Show appearances of the 1980s, symbolizing both Martin's fearless experimentation and Carson's capacity to be charmed like any other viewer. It remains proof that in comedy, sometimes the strangest trick of all is the one that leaves everyone, host included, helpless with laughter. 6. Robin Williams goes rogue. Few guests could shake up The Tonight Show the way Robin Williams did. In the early 1980s, Williams was already known for his uncontainable energy, a whirlwind of impressions, characters, and physical comedy that seemed to come from another dimension. When he stepped onto Johnny Carson's stage, the normally polished rhythm of late-night television collapsed into glorious chaos. Williams was ostensibly there to promote a film, but within seconds of sitting down, the format dissolved. He launched into rapid-fire impressions, switching from a Scottish soccer announcer to a nervous politician to a cartoon character in the span of a minute. He leapt from his chair, pantomimed entire scenes, and turned Carson's desk into a prop for his improvisational theater. The audience was in stitches, struggling to keep up with his unstoppable momentum. Behind the scenes, producers admitted they often panicked when Williams appeared. "We'd sit in the control room thinking, where is this going? Should we cut to commercial?" one director later recalled. But Carson, instead of trying to rein Williams in, waved them off. He understood that with Robin, the only option was to ride the storm. Carson's genius in these moments wasn't in steering the ship. It was in letting go of the wheel. Normally, the master of control, Johnny leaned back in his chair, wiping tears from his eyes, content to simply enjoy the spectacle. He didn't try to drag Williams back to the scripted questions. He didn't interrupt or redirect. He became, for once, the audience's surrogate, an amused spectator marveling at the wild creativity unfolding in front of him. What made these appearances so legendary was that Williams flipped The Tonight Show's dynamic. Most guests deferred to Johnny's timing, but Robin forced Johnny to follow his. It was like trying to catch lightning in a bottle while it was already running away, Carson once said. Instead of resisting, Johnny embraced it, even preparing audiences beforehand by warning them, "Expect the unexpected when Robin comes out." One particularly memorable bit saw Williams speaking in Shakespearean verse while balancing on Carson's desk, before suddenly breaking character to lampoon a commercial jingle. Carson, wiping away tears, could only shake his head in awe. Viewers at home saw something rare, the king of late night willingly surrendering his throne, if only for a few minutes, to a guest whose brilliance couldn't be tamed. Those segments became some of the most replayed of the 1980s, a testament to the unique chemistry between Carson's cool composure and Williams's volcanic spontaneity. Together, they proved that late-night television could thrive not just on structure, but on the beautiful disorder of a performer who refused to stay seated. When Don Rickles roasts Frank Sinatra. By the mid-1970s, Frank Sinatra was more than a singer. He was a cultural institution. His reputation for brilliance was matched only by his reputation for power and a sometimes volatile temper. Most comedians treated him with kid gloves, careful never to push too far. But Don Rickles was not most comedians. When Sinatra appeared on The Tonight Show in 1976, Rickles delivered one of the boldest roasts ever seen on Carson's stage. Sinatra took his seat beside Johnny, exuding the aura of untouchable celebrity that had followed him for decades. The audience applauded with reverence, fully aware they were in the presence of the chairman of the board. Then Rickles leaned forward, looked at Sinatra, and launched into his trademark brand of mockery. "Look at him, the big star. Everybody thinks he's wonderful. Let me tell you something. This man is overrated." The studio gasped, half laughing, half holding its breath. Carson's reaction was priceless, a mix of amusement and nervousness, as though he wasn't sure whether Sinatra would laugh or explode. For a few tense moments, the room felt like it was teetering on the edge of confrontation. Crew members later admitted their hearts skipped beats, wondering if Rickles had finally gone too far. But Sinatra, to everyone's relief, broke into laughter. He slapped Rickles on the back, enjoying the spectacle of being treated like any other target. In that instant, the tension vanished, replaced by roaring applause. Rickles pressed the advantage, continuing his roast, grabbing Sinatra's knee, mugging to the audience, and finally closing with, "Frank, you know I love you. Can I get a ride home?" What made the moment iconic wasn't just the comedy, it was the cultural significance. Sinatra had built his image on control, but here he allowed himself to be the butt of the joke. And it was Carson's show, with Rickles as the wild card, that created the rare space where that could happen. For Johnny, it was a perfect example of The Tonight Show's magic. Strong personalities colliding in a way no script could have predicted. Carson later admitted to his producer that the moment had genuinely rattled him at first. "Don knew exactly how far he could push," Johnny said. "But it still took guts." That guts turned into gold, an unforgettable exchange that fans requested for decades afterward. Looking back, the roast was more than just a comedy bit. It symbolized the shifting balance of power in entertainment. If Frank Sinatra, the untouchable icon, could sit there and laugh while being roasted, then no star was beyond reach. And only on Johnny Carson's stage could such a risk turn into one of television's most beloved moments. 38. Dolly Parton and the infamous comment. By 1977, Dolly Parton was already a household name. Her songwriting talent, magnetic stage presence, and down-to-earth personality had made her one of country music's brightest stars. But when she appeared on The Tonight Show opposite Johnny Carson, it wasn't just her music that drew attention. It was her unmistakable physical presence, something Dolly herself often joked about with disarming humor. That evening, Carson and Parton engaged in light-hearted banter, the kind of playful exchange audiences had come to expect. Johnny teased her about her success, her Tennessee upbringing, and her wit, while Dolly responded with her trademark warmth and quick comebacks. Then came the moment that would live on in Tonight Show lore. Glancing at her low-cut blouse, Carson leaned in and said, "I'd give a year of my life to peek under that blouse." The studio erupted, half in shocked gasps, half in laughter. Dolly, ever the professional, laughed along, brushing it off with grace. But in that instant, the carefully maintained line between Carson's usual gentlemanly persona and something more provocative had been crossed. Inside the control room, producers froze. You could feel the air tighten, one director later recalled. Everyone was thinking, did he really just say that on live television? In the 1970s, standards were looser than today. But even then, the remark was unusually direct for Johnny, who typically avoided overtly sexual comments. The fallout was immediate. NBC reportedly received an avalanche of viewer mail, more than almost any other moment in Carson's 30-year run. Some praised Johnny for his candor, arguing he had only voiced what many were already thinking. Others condemned the comment as inappropriate, disrespectful, and unbecoming of the Tonight Show host. It became one of the rare instances when Carson's judgment, usually razor-sharp, was called into question. Dolly herself never took offense. In later interviews, she even admitted she considered the comment a compliment, insisting she had always admired Carson. Her light-hearted response in the moment helped diffuse the situation. But the controversy continued to be cited as one of the most infamous Tonight Show moments. Looking back, the exchange captured a cultural turning point. Television in the 1970s was still evolving, testing the boundaries of what was acceptable for a mainstream audience. Carson's offhand remark wouldn't make it to air today, but at the time, it reflected a shifting landscape, one in which humor, candor, and public discourse about gender were colliding. For Johnny, it was a rare misstep in a career built on precision. Yet the very fact that people still discuss it decades later is proof of its impact. The moment wasn't rehearsed, and it wasn't smoothed over. It was raw, risky, and unforgettable. 9. Bob Hope. Bombs and Carson's discomfort. For much of the 20th century, Bob Hope was America's comedian-in-chief. From vaudeville to radio, film to television, he had entertained generations with his rapid-fire one-liners and his signature golf jokes. When he appeared on The Tonight Show in the early years, it was usually a highlight, a meeting of two comedy titans. But by the 1980s, those appearances began to feel less like triumphs and more like struggles, and no one was more aware of it than Johnny Carson himself. By this stage of his career, Hope was well into his 70s and 80s, and his material hadn't kept pace with the times. He often arrived with stacks of index cards, reading stale jokes about politicians or golf tournaments that felt disconnected from the moment. The audiences laughed politely, but the spark was gone. Johnny dreaded those nights, one writer later admitted. He respected Bob tremendously, but the energy just wasn't there anymore. On one particularly awkward evening, Hope launched into a series of jokes about current events. The punchlines landed with a thud, and the audience's tepid response was impossible to ignore. Carson, ever the professional, sat beside him smiling tightly, nodding at the right times. But his body language told the real story. He loosened his tie, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and exchanged knowing glances with sidekick Ed McMahon. Behind the scenes, Carson confided his frustration. "Hope doesn't listen. He just talks," he once muttered to a colleague after an especially painful segment. For a host who valued sharp timing and authentic conversation, sitting through Hope's mechanical delivery was an exercise in patience. It was as if Carson was forced to watch in real time the decline of a man he had once idolized. Producers likened it to watching a sports legend in his final season. "It was like seeing Willie Mays stumble in the outfield," one recalled. "You remembered the brilliance, but in that moment, you saw the cost of staying in the game too long." For Carson, who built his career on knowing exactly when to step aside with dignity, those appearances were an uncomfortable reminder of what he wanted to avoid. And yet, Johnny never showed open disrespect. He treated Hope with the reverence due to a pioneer, laughing where he could, gently moving the conversation along, and never allowing his private misgivings to overshadow the public moment. That balance, his private candor versus his public courtesy, was quintessential Carson. The irony was that these faltering appearances became memorable in their own right. They revealed a side of Carson rarely seen, the consummate professional silently navigating the decline of another legend. It wasn't funny in the traditional sense, but it was undeniably human, a reminder that even icons have their final acts. 10. Jimmy Stewart's poem for his dog. Few Hollywood legends carried the same gentle warmth as Jimmy Stewart. Known for films like It's a Wonderful Life and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Stewart's stammering delivery and understated sincerity made him a beloved figure both on and off screen. He was also one of Johnny Carson's most cherished guests. But in 1981, during what seemed like an ordinary Tonight Show appearance, Stewart delivered something extraordinary. A heartfelt poem that left Carson, and much of America, speechless. The segment began casually. Stewart, who was in his 70s by then, chatted with Johnny about his home life and his long career. Then, almost shyly, he mentioned he had written a poem about his dog, Bo, who had recently passed away. Carson, expecting a light-hearted anecdote, invited him to read it. What followed was one of the most emotional moments in the show's three-decade history. Stewart began softly, his familiar voice trembling as he recited verses about Bo's loyalty, his companionship, and the quiet grief of losing him. The poem, titled Bo, grew increasingly poignant as it unfolded. Lines about reaching out to stroke Bo's hair only to find him gone brought the studio to an awed silence. You could sense the audience leaning in, realizing they were witnessing something far deeper than the usual late-night banter. Carson's reaction was immediate and unguarded. Known for his composure and quick wit, he sat still, his face heavy with emotion. As Stewart's voice cracked on the final lines, "I'll always love a dog named Bo," the camera captured Johnny visibly choked up, struggling to find words. One producer later recalled, "That wasn't TV emotion. That was Johnny, the man, not the host. He was really moved." What made the moment so powerful was its raw authenticity. The Tonight Show was built on entertainment, jokes, interviews, and celebrity promotions. But here was a screen legend exposing his grief in a way that was universally relatable. And here was Johnny Carson, dropping his mask of control, allowing himself to be touched like any other viewer. The clip of Stewart's reading quickly became one of the most replayed in Tonight Show history. Fans wrote letters about how it reminded them of their own pets, their own losses, and the healing power of simple words. For Carson, who valued genuine connection above all else, it was one of those rare instances where the show transcended entertainment and became something closer to shared humanity. Years later, when people talked about Johnny's greatest moments, this one always surfaced, not for laughs, but for tears. Stewart gave America a poem. Carson gave America his silence. Together, they created one of the most unforgettable passages in television history. 11. The Snake Escapes, during Joan Embry's segment. Among The Tonight Show's most beloved recurring guests was Joan Embry of the San Diego Zoo. She brought everything from tiny parrots to massive elephants onto Carson's stage, giving audiences both laughter and a touch of wonder. While these animal segments were always unpredictable, one appearance in the late 1970s provided a level of chaos and comedy that even Johnny himself couldn't contain. That night, Embry arrived with an assortment of creatures, but the star of the lineup was a massive Burmese python. Draped casually around her shoulders, the snake stretched more than 10 feet long and weighed as much as a small child. Johnny, though always polite with Embry, was visibly uneasy. He leaned back in his chair, cracking jokes to mask his discomfort, while the audience chuckled at his nervous glances. The demonstration began smoothly. Embry described the snake's habits and diet, pointing out its impressive size. But midway through her explanation, the python began to stir. Slowly at first, then with surprising speed, it slid off the desk and toward Carson's chair. Johnny's reaction was instant and genuine. He leapt to his feet, eyes wide, and backed across the stage as though his life depended on it. The audience exploded into laughter, cheering louder the farther he retreated. "This was no act," a floor director later recalled. "Johnny wasn't playing it up for the cameras. That was pure fight-or-flight instinct, right there on live television." His normally impeccable composure was gone, replaced with the very human reaction of a man who wanted nothing to do with a giant snake. Embry and her assistants scrambled to corral the python, eventually lifting it back into control. Once the danger, or at least the chaos, was over, Johnny returned to his seat, straightened his tie, and delivered the perfect punchline. "Somebody better check my pants." The audience erupted again, this time not only at the joke but at the honesty behind it. What made the moment unforgettable was how it stripped Carson of his carefully crafted image. He was no longer the unflappable host, the smooth master of ceremonies. He was every viewer at home who would have bolted if a 60-pound snake came slithering their way. And instead of trying to reclaim dignity, Johnny leaned into the absurdity, proving once again that he was never above being the butt of the joke if it meant entertaining his audience. The snake escape quickly became one of The Tonight Show's most requested clips, replayed on anniversaries and retrospectives. It was the perfect example of Carson's genius, turning vulnerability into comedy and fear into a moment of television history. 12. George Carlin's subtle censorship jab. When George Carlin appeared on The Tonight Show in 1983, audiences expected sharp observations and quick wit. Carlin had already established himself as one of comedy's most fearless truth-tellers, famous for challenging society's boundaries, especially with his 7 words you can never say on television routine. Yet on Carson's stage, where network censors kept a close watch, Carlin had to walk a careful line. What he delivered that night was a masterclass in subtle rebellion. The set began innocently enough. Carlin riffed on the little absurdities of everyday life, traffic habits, grocery store lines, and the quirks of language. His delivery was calm, almost gentle, a contrast to the sharp-edged Carlin audiences knew from his stand-up specials. But tucked inside his monologue was a sly twist, a play on words that cleverly hinted at the very kind of profanity NBC forbade. It was so quick and so smart that many viewers missed it entirely. Carson, however, caught it immediately. The camera captured his knowing smile and quick glance to the audience, as if to say, "Yes, I heard that too, but let's let it slide." He didn't interrupt, didn't correct, and didn't distance himself from the joke. Instead, he silently joined Carlin in the rebellion, allowing the bit to land without a word of interference. "Joe, that was Johnny's brilliance," one Tonight Show writer recalled. He could have shut it down, but he respected cleverness more than he worried about rules. In that moment, he was Carlin's co-conspirator. Behind the scenes, network executives were less amused. Some reportedly demanded to know how the line made it past the standards department. Carson defended Carlin, arguing that if the censors hadn't noticed in real time, then the comedian had earned the right to sneak it through. The brilliance of the exchange was its subtlety. This wasn't Carlin standing on stage swearing defiantly. It was Carlin demonstrating that words and meaning could be bent, twisted, and reshaped to outwit even the strictest rules. For Carson, who had his own long-standing battles with network interference, it was a sly moment of solidarity. Viewers who caught the line felt as though they were in on a secret, part of an inside joke shared between Carlin, Carson, and those sharp enough to notice. Decades later, fans still talk about the appearance as one of Carlin's smartest Tonight Show moments, not because it was loud or outrageous, but because it showed how comedy could dance around censorship with elegance. And for Carson, it was yet another reminder of his greatest strength as a host, knowing when to step back and let his guests shine, even if it meant quietly thumbing his nose at the network in the process. 13. Dean Martin's drunk act kills on stage. By the 1970s, Dean Martin was a fixture of American entertainment. Known as part of the Rat Pack with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., Martin had perfected a stage persona that mixed effortless charm with the appearance of mild intoxication. His half-slurred delivery, casual swagger, and ever-present glass in hand made him look like the life of the party. But behind that act was a sharp, comic mind, and nowhere did it shine brighter than his appearances on The Tonight Show. On one unforgettable evening, Martin leaned into his drunk act harder than ever. From the moment he walked out, he stumbled slightly, missing the seat as he tried to sit down beside Carson. The audience erupted in laughter, convinced they were seeing the real Martin, tipsy and unfiltered. But Johnny knew better. With a twinkle in his eye, he settled into the role of straight man, giving Martin space to milk every gag. The conversation veered all over the place. Carson asked a simple question about Martin's Las Vegas shows, and Dean responded with a rambling anecdote about golf, punctuated by pauses and confused expressions. Midway through the story, he lost his train of thought entirely, shrugged, and muttered, "Ah, who cares? It wasn't funny anyway." The line, delivered with perfect timing, sent the audience into hysterics. Behind the scenes, producers later admitted they couldn't tell how much of Martin's behavior was real and how much was performance. "That was his genius," one said. "He blurred the line so completely that even the crew didn't know. But Johnny did." He knew Dean was in control the whole time. Carson's reactions, his raised eyebrows, his tight smile, his bursts of laughter, became the perfect foil for Martin's antics. What made the segment so memorable was the chemistry between the two men. Carson, the master of composure, allowed Martin to unravel on stage, yet never let the show descend into chaos. Martin, in turn, played his role to perfection, embodying the persona of the lovable drunk without ever losing his sharp, comedic instincts. Some critics later questioned whether celebrating alcohol as comedy was wise, especially on national television. But audiences adored it. For them, Martin represented the ultimate entertainer, relaxed, irreverent, and always in on the joke. The segment became one of the most rewatched Tonight Show moments of the decade, a reminder that sometimes the best comedy is the one that feels dangerously close to real life. For Carson, the night reinforced a lesson he already knew well. His greatest strength wasn't always telling the joke himself, but knowing when to step back and let a guest steal the show. And on that evening, Dean Martin stole it with a glass in hand and a grin that told everyone he knew exactly what he was doing. 14. Johnny crashes his own monologue. For 3 decades, Johnny Carson's nightly monologue was as dependable as the ticking of a clock. It was the ritual that opened The Tonight Show. A few minutes of topical jokes delivered with Carson's signature mix of polish and sly wit. The routine was so ingrained that any deviation from it felt seismic. And in the early 1980s, when Don Rickles decided to interfere, the result became one of Carson's most surprising and funniest moments. Carson had just launched into his opening monologue, delivering jokes about politics and everyday absurdities, when a voice suddenly cut through from backstage. The audience stirred in confusion. It was unmistakably Rickles, heckling Johnny from behind the curtain. "What kind of joke was that?" he barked, his timing sharp enough to stop Carson mid-sentence. For a beat, Johnny stood frozen. The king of late night interrupted in his most sacred space. Then, instead of pressing on, he broke character completely. Looking toward the wings, he shouted, "Don, get out here!" It was unscripted, unrehearsed, and completely against the Tonight Show's format. Rickles emerged, feigning innocence, arms spread wide as if he had no idea he'd just derailed the show. The audience roared, sensing they were watching a genuine disruption. Carson, abandoning his stack of jokes, invited Rickles straight to the guest chair, nearly a full segment before he was scheduled. What followed was a comedic free-for-all, Johnny tossing aside his monologue while Rickles teased, mocked, and needled him in the way only he could. Behind the scenes, producers were startled. Johnny never gave up his monologue, one later recalled. It was his anchor, his control. For him to throw it away like that told you everything about his love for Rickles. Their friendship was built on trust and unpredictability. Carson knew Rickles would deliver, and Rickles knew Johnny could handle any chaos he caused. The brilliance of the moment was in its spontaneity. Late-night television thrived on routine, but here was Carson showing that he could abandon the script in favor of something more alive. It was a reminder that the best comedy sometimes happens when the plan falls apart. Fans later ranked the interruption among their favorite Carson-Rickles exchanges. It wasn't just a funny bit. It was a rare look at Johnny's willingness to break his own rules for the sake of genuine entertainment. That night, the monologue didn't matter. What mattered was 2 friends, 2 legends, making each other and millions of viewers laugh in the most unplanned way possible. 15. Sammy Davis Jr.'s rapid-fire impression blitz. Among all the stars who graced The Tonight Show, Few matched the sheer versatility of Sammy Davis Jr., singer, dancer, actor, comedian. He could do it all. A member of the Rat Pack alongside Sinatra and Dean Martin, Davis carried with him a reputation for dazzling audiences with his range of talents. But one night in the 1970s, he stunned Carson's studio not with music or dance, but with an astonishing showcase of mimicry that left both Johnny and his viewers in awe. The moment began almost casually. Carson asked Davis about some of the performers he'd worked with over the years. Instead of responding with anecdotes, Davis leaned back, tilted his head, and suddenly launched into a perfect impression of Frank Sinatra. The voice, the mannerisms, even the tilt of the jaw, it was uncanny. Before the audience had finished laughing, Davis pivoted seamlessly into Jerry Lewis, bouncing with manic energy and exaggerated expressions. Within seconds, he shifted again, this time into Jimmy Stewart, complete with halting speech and bashful pauses. The studio erupted. Carson doubled over, clutching his stomach, unable to maintain his usual composure. This wasn't polite laughter for the sake of the show. It was genuine, helpless amusement. Johnny loved it when someone truly surprised him, a camera operator later recalled. And Sammy did that better than almost anyone. What made the routine extraordinary was the speed and precision with which Davis transformed. There were no props, no pauses, no setup, just one impression after another, each nailed with uncanny accuracy. It was as though he had an entire cast of Hollywood legends living inside him, waiting to leap out at will. Carson's role in the exchange was equally important. He leaned back, giving Davis room, his laughter serving as the audience's cue. Occasionally he tried to interject, only to dissolve into laughter again as Davis rolled out yet another impression. For a host who valued timing and professionalism, Johnny was content to surrender, enjoying the ride as much as the viewers at home. Producers later described the sequence as one of the purest displays of raw talent they'd ever witnessed on the show. Davis wasn't promoting an album or a movie. He wasn't selling anything. He was simply entertaining, showing off the breadth of his skills because he could. The clip has since become a fan favorite, replayed countless times as evidence of Davis's brilliance. It also cemented his reputation in Carson's eyes as the most complete entertainer of his era. For Johnny, who saw thousands of guests cycle through his stage, Sammy Davis Jr. stood apart as someone who could become anyone. That night, The Tonight Show wasn't just about Johnny Carson. It was about watching a master of transformation remind the world why he belonged among the greats. 16. Arnold Schwarzenegger speaks only in German. By the mid-1980s, Arnold Schwarzenegger had already conquered bodybuilding and was on his way to Hollywood superstardom with films like Conan the Barbarian and The Terminator. His charisma and thick Austrian accent made him an instantly recognizable figure. When he appeared on The Tonight Show to promote one of his new movies, most expected the usual mix of promotion and light banter. Instead, Schwarzenegger decided to test Johnny Carson's legendary composure with a prank that no one saw coming. The interview began normally enough. Carson greeted Arnold warmly and asked a standard opening question about his latest film. But rather than answering in English, Schwarzenegger launched into a lengthy, earnest response entirely in German. The audience chuckled nervously at first, unsure whether it was a bit or a misunderstanding. Johnny's expression quickly shifted from curiosity to complete bewilderment. Still, Carson didn't flinch. Instead of stopping the segment or asking for a translation, he leaned into the absurdity. With a perfectly straight face, he nodded as if he understood every word, occasionally chiming in with gibberish phrases that sounded vaguely German but made no sense. The audience erupted once they realized Johnny was playing along, laughing harder with each fake yeah, and nonsense syllable he muttered. The gag continued for several minutes, with Schwarzenegger delivering what appeared to be a passionate monologue in German, while Carson matched him with comically serious reactions. Finally, Arnold broke character, laughing and switching back to English. He admitted he had always wanted to see how Johnny would handle it. Carson, wiping away tears of laughter, shook his head and told him, "You got me." Behind the scenes, producers confirmed the entire bit was unplanned. Johnny had no clue, one director recalled, but he was so quick on his feet. Instead of looking like the fool, he turned the joke into gold by pretending he was in on it. That was Carson's genius. He never fought against a moment that had comic potential. He simply adapted and found a way to make it even funnier. For Schwarzenegger, the prank revealed his own underrated comedic instincts, something that would later serve him well in films like Twins and Kindergarten Cop. For Carson, it was another reminder that the best Tonight Show moments came from unpredictability, when the script disappeared, and all that remained was instinct, timing, and trust in the audience's laughter. The segment has since been remembered not just as a playful prank, but as a perfect example of Carson's unique ability to thrive in chaos. Even when he didn't understand a word, he understood comedy, and that was enough to make the moment legendary.